that option. I don't know, you can.
And I can cut this later too, so it's okay.
Okay. All right, let me know when you two are ready.
We're ready. Thank you.
All right. Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion today on alternative structures for nonprofits. My name is Sean Goode, and I steward a nonprofit in the greater Seattle area called Choose180, where we work to transform systems that cause harm and support the young people who have been impacted by those systems. Today, I have with me Daniel Perez and Shevanthi Daniel. I'll let the two of them introduce themselves and the causes they represent, and then we'll dive right in.
Excellent.
Daniel?
Thanks, Sean.
Okay,
Go
I'll
ahead,
jump in.
Daniel.
Thanks, Sean. Hi all, great to be with you. My name is Daniel. I'm the elected Vice President of Organizing for the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union. We're a volunteer-run union, composed of nearly 50 units at organizations like the Economic Policy Institute, where I work, at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, at the ACLU, Brookings. We represent, I could go through the list of 50, but I won't. We represent almost 2,000 workers. And with respect to leadership structure, we have an executive board that's elected by our membership. I see myself as just a facilitator in helping workers claim and channel their collective power. The workers at the organizations are the real makers of their destiny, and they're the folks who are, raising the standards of the nonprofit industry. And so I help connect folks with resources to form a union, to bargain a contract, and to enforce that contract. And I do this on a voluntary basis because the union has done so much for me in helping me secure a living wage, job security, opportunities for advancement. And I want to see that from my fellow workers across the industry, shop by shop. So pass it off to my co-panelists.
Thanks, Daniel. And we share a name, so when I hear Daniel, I immediately respond. I appreciate the time, and Sean, thank you for welcoming all of us and opening us up. My name is Shevanthi Daniel. I have been in the nonprofit sector for almost all of my career, about 20 years now, mostly in large national organizations, some labor unions, some nonprofit organizations, and more recently at the Democracy at Work Institute, where we have a workplace that is democratically managed. And so that's why I'm here on the panel today to share a little bit of my insights, being part of an organization that is democratically managed. And our organization's mission also helps to ensure that worker cooperatives grow in the US economic sector. So we help businesses become worker owned. So there's a bit of an interesting piece about our work that is both, we are practitioners of our own organization where we're practicing democracy and shared democratic management, while at the same time helping companies that are for-profit transition to worker owned. So I'm excited to be here and eager to have this conversation.
And it's a timely conversation indeed. I mean, we are in the midst of what has been dubbed the Great Resignation for many reasons, and an uprising of employee rights that we haven't seen in generations. And it's really an exciting time for the folks who have been doing the mainline, frontline work, because there's a space being created for their voice to be heard in ways that it hasn't been historically. And that's really what brings the three of us together in some respect, is that all of us are championing different approaches to creating equitable spaces for folks in the nonprofit industrial complex to be able to have thriving wages and not just barely get by. And we understand it because, historically, the nonprofit industrial complex has a market rate set where they minimally value folks like us and the way that we serve in the spaces that we serve in. And we see that demonstrated in the way that wages play out. I'm constantly reminded that we have folks working in nonprofit organizations that serve, folks who are living in house, for example, or food banks, or organizations like ours that are working to offset the harm caused by systems of injustice. And if we're not careful, we could be resourcing our team members to be benefiting from our services, as well as serving those who are within our organization. I know that way too well personally. When I worked at a large nonprofit, I couldn't even afford to send my son to the summer camps that I was overseeing. This is deeply problematic, but it's a narrative that in some respect, many of us have owned and assumed that, well, it's just the way it is because that's the way nonprofits function. Well, we're at a critical time in our country where it's an opportunity to press pause on that redundant narrative and say, wait, but why? Why is it that the market rate for people who are serving in the nonprofits is so low? Why is it that it's hard to make a living wage when you're serving community? Why is it that those jobs aren't valued? Why is the labor of those human beings that are serving in those spaces not valued the same as folks working at city or county entities? Why is this? And who is dictating this? And I am beginning to get more and more persuaded that we can do something about it. And that's the strength of our time together and the brilliance of our collective. And I'm excited to tease some of this out from the different approaches that we all have had the opportunity to take. And in that, what my experience has been is that the power and the greatest power comes from the collective us, and that all these things change and all these things move because those that are closest to the pain points are the ones who are moving things forward and causing disruption in effort to make things change. But if that was all it took, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. Shevanthi, Daniel, why do you think it's so hard to build power?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think the challenge of building power is partly the institutions that we are all in and the systems that we're up against, but it's also partly our mindset as workers, how we engage in our workplace and how we build power together. So that for me, there's always two sides to that equation. I think institutions are having to change. They're seeing drastic social and economic issues that are really getting organizations to rethink how they deal with race, how they deal with equity, how they deal with gender. And I think that from an organizational sense, it's important, but we can't wait for organizations to shift. We have to also, as workers, demand that shift, and that requires a level of building power that I think is essential. And that how we build power there are variable ways to do that, right? Union organizing is one, building worker-owned cooperatives is another, making small edges to incremental changes within a institution is another way. So, I think that's where I want to start is like, what's the role and responsibility of us as workers in our workplace to make that change?
Thank you for that, Daniel.
Yeah, to your question, why is it hard for us to build power? Great question. I think you kind of spoke to it a bit. You talked about how, the nonprofit industry, the industry in which we work, there's like a historical culture, that's rooted in the history of charity work. And that's like suffering for the cause of the work we do. It's, if you're not working those long hours, if you're not taking that late night call, or if you're concerned about like the money you're making, the culture is that you may not seem as committed to the work that you're doing, and that culture is toxic. It's bad for turnover. It's not just like immoral and unjust. It leads to burnout. It makes our organizations less effective, and yeah, so it can be hard to overcome that like culture that is really embedded in the nonprofit industrial complex. And then sometimes it's hard to build power because, workers come, they'll form a union, they'll come to NPU and we'll help them. And then they encounter, really fierce resistance from bosses when workers want to join a union. And sometimes that comes from reluctance of those who hold power to want to share power with staff. Sometimes it's a reluctance of bosses to commit money to pay livable wages. Sometimes it's both, or it's other reasons. So, there's also that dynamic of trying to carve out a seat at the table. And sometimes I'm seeing less and less of this, fortunately. It's, trade unionism can kind of evoke in people's minds, images of auto workers or, heavy industry workers. But actually, 3 in 10 union workers, this comes from the research I do at EPI, actually work in education or health industry. Almost 50%, it's 47.1 to be precise, percent of union workers are actually women. More than a third are workers of color. So unions in the nonprofit industry can seem like a novel concept, but from my experience at NPU, it's a concept whose time has come, and I hope will continue expanding the number of workers who are part of a union. So yeah, those are among some of the reasons why it's been difficult to build power.
Yeah, there's that through line of like, it's hard to build power if you're not aware that you have power, and it's hard to be aware if you have power that you have power if you feel disempowered in the work that you're doing, right? And then there's always like the capacity too, right? Like, and I think you both kind of spoke to it, right? In the nonprofit space, all of us are really familiar with like super long days, super low wage, feeling really great, warm and fuzzy about what it is you're doing, but like you're exhausted. And so you may want to organize, but like organize with what kind of energy? Like, where am I going to get that energy from? Like I'm just barely making it through today. I'd have more energy if I was making a living wage, because then I wouldn't be as stressed and worried about how I can both like serve community and be able to, build wealth. And the two shouldn't be mutually exclusive. Although I think that historically the nonprofit space has purchased a narrative with all of its extra money that it could be giving to staff to be able to earn a wage that allows them to thrive. So in that, right? So we understand the complexity of building power, but what does it look like when an organization is in a space where the team is building power? Daniel, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah. I'd say oftentimes when workers are building power in the workplace, or rather I'd say like there's never a wrong time, to start building power in the workplace. There's never a wrong time to reach out to a union organizer, build support for the union at your workplace, talk to your coworkers about the things you like about your organization or that you don't like, that you do like. It's always appropriate to start getting your coworkers to sign union authorization cards. And usually this process kicks off when workers at an organization, have something really bad happen, there's like mistreatment, someone's been fired, a lack of transparency. And there's just a history of tension at an organization that's maybe come to a head. And this is often the time when people reach out to us. It doesn't have to be that way, folks can be proactive and reach out to us about organizing. But oftentimes, it comes from a place of reaction. And the past 2 years, the COVID, the pandemic, the economic downturn, it's been a year of explosive growth, two years now of explosive growth for NPEU. And, it's, folks who reached out to us, are uncertain about what the economic downturn means for them, what the pandemic means for our health and safety. But, we've almost doubled in size since March of 2020, when everything was locking down, shutting down. And what it's meant for those workplaces that have organized with us, we've been able to negotiate, memorandums of understanding over vaccine mandates, over health and safety measures, stipends for working at home and setting up an office and taking on those cost burdens of, work from home. We've been able, at the few nonprofits that have had, layoffs, unfortunately, we've been able to negotiate really strong, robust severance packages for workers. So, people came to us during a time of uncertainty, and I think we're able to deliver on, some of those benefits and from negotiating. So yeah, I mean, I'll get into more of that a little later. I'll talk about like some of the, wins we've secured as a result of impact negotiations. But yeah, that's kind of what it's looked like in the nonprofit union space.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I was worried that you're getting too much into the next question. I was like, come on, man, like you're gonna answer the next question right now before we get to that question. Like, we can't have that, okay? Like, pace yourself, all right? Pace yourself. Shevanthi has a whole slideshow that's coming up in a minute, and we don't want to jump over the slideshow, okay? I know all of us are like, are sitting on the edge of our seats just waiting for those slides to come across. Shevanthi, what are your thoughts? When is the right time, and what does it look like?
I think the right time is really when an organization is ready for change. I think it's a lot to take on, at someone from, depending on what kind of nonprofit you are, what kind of relationships you have with your peers, with your supervisors, that can all cause challenging conversations, right? And so I think there needs to be at some base level, like a desire from an organization to build trust, to move in a new direction. It doesn't mean everybody at all levels have to be on the same page, but I think there needs to be some desire from the organization at large that change is required. And then a budget, like money set aside to explicitly begin that process, whether it be hiring, a consultant to come in and walk people through a year's worth of work, or to talk to a union and begin organizing, or to build committees that will really think through different segments of your nonprofit and what changes will happen and manage that change effectively. So I think at the highest level, it's the organization's commitment, and then you need to see a dollar amount with that commitment. And then of course, it's the organizing of ourselves as workers to participate in that change, and really finding the ways in which we can make the most impact, and taking a role in that decision making, and having it be real changes that we're proposing, that it's not just few trainings throughout the year, or small minimal changes that band-aid something, but really are addressing the wider problem.
Yeah. Like, put your money where your mouth is, right? Like, real investments in change, right? Not like token workshops or strategic consultations that never actually materialize into anything substantial. And I think about our organization, and I'm going to talk more about this a bit later. Teaser of how we raised our wages to 70K. But when it came to building power, like, it really was the folks on the direct line that were closest to the pain point that were saying, like, this is not sustainable. And even though we were paying wages that were above market rate with the rate of inflation means absolutely nothing in 2022. I was looking at a CNN article today that was talking about rents increasing in some spaces over 20%. I remember sitting in middle school. This is a long time ago. For some of you, this may not be familiar to you at all. We used to like go through we'd have a checkbook, and they teach us how to write checks. The checks are these things on pieces of paper that you wrote numbers on and then signed at the bottom. And you'd actually have to spell out the amount of money that you were. And anyhow, it's old technology. And then we'd have to like balance our checkbook. And then they'd also say things like, you want to make sure that your rent isn't more than 30% of your salary, right? And then like, that's still like the narrative, but when wages don't keep up with the cost of rent, then like, how is that even plausible? And so I would encourage folks that are closest to the pain point Like the best time to organize is when it feels when you feel ouch. And then begin to connect with other people who are also proximate to the pain point to assure that you're not alone in that feeling. And then collaboratively find an earnest and authentic way to amplify that shared voice, because the power really lives in the collective. Without our organization, we would have never gotten to the place where we were paying people a minimum of 70K if it wasn't for the people on the doing direct service that were courageous enough to say, look, this is not sustainable for me. And to not just say, look, this is not sustainable, but to continue to press forward, even in spite of my own reluctance. And then I'll share more about that in a bit. But when? Right now. Right now is the right time. There's no time like the present, particularly in the midst of this great resignation. Employers are losing a ton of money with open positions that are going unfilled because people simply don't want to take the pledge of poverty to serve their community anymore. People believe that you should be able to do both and serve and not live in poverty. Like it's not an abstract concept. It's a reality folks are believing in. It's a good business model, and it's great to honor people and their humanity. Push on it now and lean into others that are sharing in a similar pain point. And collaboratively, your voice is the ethos of the organization. Without you, the work doesn't get done. People like me who serve as executive directors only have impact because you have impact. So absent of your impact on the direct line, folks that are most proximate to the pain point, right? The work is non-existent. We need you more than you need us. So your voice is significant in every single matter. Practically though, right? Shevanthi, like, what do the steps look like? I mean, I'm pitching a dream, right? I'm saying like, get together with your collective, right? Amplify your voices. Like in different contexts, this can look different. What does it look like in the context that you share to actually, the steps to take to get to a place where you're amplifying in that way?
Sure. I'm going
Look at
to
that.
start my slide.
I just want to call out the seamless transition to the slideshow. Like that was like, absolutely. Well done.
Absolutely. Yes. So I just want to remind folks this, I'm going to speak specifically about my experience at the Democracy at Work Institute, which is an organization that decided we're a nonprofit, we're national, we have staff all over the country, and we decided we wanted to build a democratically managed organization. And we have a unique structure, and we utilized the principles that come out of the worker co-op sector. So businesses that are currently worker owned are worker cooperatives. If you're unfamiliar, I can go over that in a little bit during the Q&A. But I'll start first with a framework that we like to use of a foundation. Any sort of building structure has to have a foundation. So similar to that, we think of a democratic organization needing a solid structure that has 4 corner posts. And those are money, information, power, and people. Without these 4, you really have a unstable structure. And so that's key to sort of starting this conversation. So I'll go into each of these corner posts very briefly. So what I mean when I say information is that in any nonprofit, people are paying attention to what is taking place outside of their organization, right? What are the changes that clients need? What are the social or economic impacts being felt by the people we're serving? And then there are internal changes as well that people are paying attention to. That's like resources and capacity. How much staff time are we putting into projects? Who's overworked? How much money are we spending? Who's getting paid what? That's information that needs to be shared across the organization. Oftentimes in traditional organizations, some people hold all the information and other people don't have a window into it. And so we always start with the sharing of information, and it goes both ways. Workers can contribute to info sharing just as much as managers or executives of an organization should be transparent about pay structures, budget, building budgets for the year, how spending is going, how fundraising is being planned, what programs are being prioritized. So that at that level, organizations can begin to share information and prepare people to participate in the decisions of their organization. The second corner post is people. So with the added information, we also need people to be trained on how to meaningfully make decisions about money. If you're getting to see your organization's budget, you need to know how to read a budget. You need to understand, what am I looking for? What do I need to worry about? What do I need to advocate for as a worker? And that in that shared information, there's also power to make real decisions. And that requires education as well. We don't just walk in and are given, the reins of decision making. We all have our own dynamics of power within our peers, as well as within an organization. And so it's really important that we all as workers learn the skills needed to govern and contribute to the decisions that our workplace is offering us an opportunity to participate in. So that takes investment. And I mentioned that early end, so an organization really needs to put money into developing their staff and empowering people to understand how to participate and how to manage as a group or as a collective in key critical decisions for the organization. The third corner post is power. This is where there are two types of power that we see. It's democratic in the democratic workplace. One is the power of voice, and the other is the power of our vote. So voice is oftentimes consultative. It can be gathered in multiple settings, and almost anyone, whether you're a member of the organization or a non-voting member, you have some opportunity to provide voice. A vote is where you have real power. And so we try to ensure that we have seats on the governing board of all of the nonprofits that we work at. So in our organization, we make sure workers get elected in, and that workers have a say at the board level where bigger decisions are being made. The last and fourth corner post is money. This is less relevant to our specific situation because in nonprofits, we don't have profit sharing, but in worker cooperative businesses, there is profit sharing. At the end of each year, the business can specify an amount of money that is then provided back out to the workers for the labor that they've provided in patronage. And so that's something that we're working towards, right? In the nonprofit sector, what might be more applicable is the compensation system. That matters. Having a transparent compensation system, knowing where you stand, what the range of pay someone else gets in the same job as you or at the same level as you. Those are all very important pieces. The other thing that we do is set a 3-to-1 wage ratio between the highest paid and the lowest paid so that there's wage equity. So we have transparency and wage equity in our organization. So I'll stop there. And actually, I'll share one more thing. One thing that's running through all of this is trust. You need to have trust built in to the organization, and this requires hard work from leadership as well as teams to do trust building work, whether it be in retreats or over the course of several years, where people are really committed to building these relationships, that management is competent, open to input, that your systems allow for more democratic participation, and that people are skilled at communicating and potentially dealing with conflict, because as you bring in more voices and exercise your own voice, you need to learn how to respectfully disagree or challenge someone that might be your peer or your manager. So those sort of things are really important, and the trust building is an investment on the part of the organization to ensure that employees are getting the support that they need to participate in a meaningful way. Thanks.
Thanks, Shevanthi. I think about the trust like being mixed into the cement and the foundation of it all, right? And like a question I would have for you, and I'm going to ask it out, even though it's not Q&A time. I'm just curious. When is it possible for organizations to begin that process without already having trust established?
I think it's possible. I think it does take a concerted effort among and I keep pointing to leadership, because even if there's a groundswell, you still need leadership buy-in, because all of what I described takes money to produce. And so I think you can develop trust through the process. So you know, ideally you'd build trust first, and you'd be on common ground, and you can start laying some foundational sort of pathways for people to participate. But I think you could also back channel that, and through participation, discover areas where trust is weak and help build a stronger foundation for trust.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Daniel, what does it look like in union organizing, like practical steps that people can take to lean in with power?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by your presentation, Shevanthi. And I think there's a lot of overlap in the way unions remap the center of power in the nonprofit industry. Typically, there is one center of power in our organizations, and that's, or at least the way I conceive of it. You know, and that's typically the traditional, you know, the executive suite, CEOs or EDs, or however, you know, they title themselves. No shade to you, Sean. And yeah, forming a union is a way for staff to, you know, pool our individual power and speak with the collective voice and demand a seat at the table. And so our unionized nonprofits, you know, within NPU, you know, we have two centers of power, and that's the executive team and all of us, you know, all of the workers. And I was just hearing Shevanthi speak about like the information sharing aspect. And what's really great about, you know, working in a union nonprofit is that, you know, we have tools to compel leadership to share that information that we don't always have. You know, we can see salaries for staff, and, you know, oftentimes we share that voluntarily with each other, but during the negotiation process and bargaining, we can submit a slew of, you know, requests for information and get a sense of how the organization is being managed, get a sense of how the decisions are being made. And through, you know, labor management committees, you know, the union leadership, you know, meeting regularly with, you know, the organization leadership, you know, we can advocate and give input and help, you know, shape our planning and long-term planning of our organizations. And so there does seem like there's some overlap there. And yeah, that's, yeah, I'll leave it right there, but.
It's what's cool to hear, like both of you, the intentionality behind the approaches. And then what I feel like we as an organization at Choose180 may have stumbled upon haphazardly, absent of intention, but just out of like acknowledging the struggle and wanting to respond to the harm that was being caused. Yeah, because I when I look at the framework, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see that. Right? Like I know within our cause, you know, we had a couple folks from dominant culture, and we largely employ Black and brown folks. So we had a couple folks from dominant culture who began to step up and voice their complaints around wages. And again, it wasn't because we were like below market rate; it was just the market rate wasn't good enough. And when they surfaced it in the beginning, I was like, yeah, join the club. Like, you know, who in the nonprofit is happy about what they make? Like, this is the career you chose. This is the plight that you've taken upon yourself. Like, okay, deal with it. And I wasn't that, you know, I wasn't that like, you know, harsh with it, but like, I mean, that was sort of my perspective, because I remember what it was like to not make anything and work at a nonprofit. And I had like this narrative in mind, like, well, if I can do it, so can you, right? As if like my struggle should justify someone else's struggle because it's the rite of passage in the nonprofit industrial complex. But I held that tension with the same feeling that like, not everybody should want to be a director, an executive director, or a manager. There should be people who are doing what they want to do and love it and be able to make a living wage at it. And so when those voices begin to multiply and it came to budget time for us, I had a conversation with one of our directors, and I was saying, you know, dream big. You know, if you want to add staff, add staff. And they were like, wait, what? Like, how? I don't feel like it's ethical for us to talk about adding staff when we have team members who aren't making a living wage right now. But how often is that a conversation in nonprofits about like growing programs or adding staff while people aren't making a living wage? And then when they asked me this poignant question of, is it possible that we are supporting our team to live in the same material conditions that we're working to move people out of? And in essence, are we doing great work with our left hand and causing harm with our right? That was a kind of a gut punch. And then when I talked to the actual team members who had a couple in the office that day, and they shared with me their lived experience, like it was heartbreaking. And it was unfortunate that it took all that for me to get it, because I had been so distant from the pain point for so long that I forgot what it actually felt like to be in that space. And I think many executive leaders are in similar positions where, they may have grown up in the nonprofit space and made nominal wages and barely got by, and now they're executives or CEOs or whatever it's called, and they're like, "What? This is just how it is. It's just how it goes." And they're it's not that they're afraid to rewrite the narrative. I think that some people aren't aware that they have the power to do it. And I know I certainly wasn't aware. It took a groundswell of voices, the narratives of those that are most proximate to the pain points, for me to have enough of a reflective moment to recognize that, like, the only thing keeping us from making a living wage, from raising the wages to a minimum of 70K, was me. And approval from the board, of course, but like really, it was me. And we did all the background stuff. I mean, the folks that would begin to voice their complaints and concerns, instigated a compensation evaluation that we did within the organization. The compensation evaluation pointed to wage, but it also pointed to other things like, how do we honor lived experience? How do we honor folks with degrees? How do we honor how do we honor time served at the organization? Do we do merit rate increases, or do we do cost of living increases? Like, what do all these things surface, but at the core was this conversation about wage. And even when our committee brought this report to me from the team, I looked at it and said, yeah, I would love that to happen too. In a perfect world, that would be great, but we work at nonprofits. And it's just unfortunate that it took the continual pressure of our team, and the testimony of those who have been impacted, to get me as an executive director, someone with lived experience, who's lived unhoused, who's made these minimal wages in a nonprofit sector, but because I've been removed from it for a couple of years, distant just enough for it to get beyond the horizon for me to no longer have it in my purview, that this is what the experience is really like. But once I understood it and understood that I was causing harm and that I was responsible for the harm that was being caused, then there was no other choice. There was no other option. We simply had to get right, at least in this one point, while we worked to build cohesion around the others. Because what we weren't going to do is continue to pay people less than a living wage while we asked them to work with the consultant to determine all the other variables that will go into our compensation philosophy. And that was the catalyst for change within our cause. And so, looking at your frameworks and hearing you share, I see some of what we did reflected within those quadrants, absent of great intention. But man, if folks had that to operate from as they were organizing within their causes, it wouldn't have to be such an uphill battle. Because if it took so much for me, someone who should be proximate enough to get it to move, man, it's been that much more difficult working with others who have also bought into the lie that this is just the way that nonprofits function. Which leads me to my next question. Daniel, first, like, practically, can you give me examples of what this actually looks like?
Yeah. It's fascinating hearing your story. And I think where like unions really fit in right there is that they kind of reduce those like frictions, learning how to, implement new pay structure, what have you, make changes in the workplace. Because this is, there's kind of like a structure already in place, for collective bargaining, for, requesting information, for, yeah, it's just like, unions have been around in their current legal structure for, I don't know, since 1940s now, when the NLRA passed. And so there's a structure, and, not everybody has to reinvent the wheel to get, pay increases or, better benefits and stuff. So, yeah. Yeah, so just to, I guess, share some examples of like things we've accomplished through, the union model of, alternative structures for nonprofits, are, we've gotten higher wage floors, year after year. We used to give people rebates on like their union dues because, when we first started organizing, a lot of the wage floors at these like nonprofits were so low that we didn't want to like create an even larger burden for folks, having them pay union dues. But year after year, we're raising, the wage floor, 45,000, 50,000, 55,000. And so folks are, seeing a big return on, organizing a workplace. You pay $300 in union dues, $400 or $500 in a year. But if you've made a $15,000 wage gain in the past 3 years, like, it's already paid for itself. But it's also not just about wages. It's about, just cause protections. You can't be fired, on the whim of, a manager. It's about having dignity in the workplace and autonomy and respect. It's not, I don't want to, we it just around wages because it's not just that. It's being able to advocate for yourself and your colleagues. And, we do something really cool. We do pay equity reviews at the Economic Policy Institute, and we share all of our wages with folks. And then, every year we'll come to management and we'll be like, hey, we've brought some people on board and, it looks like there's discrepancy, doing among folks who are doing the same work for different pay. And we've been able to secure, wage corrections, based off those clauses in our union contracts. Recently we want to see on our board of directors, we came to management and we said, this is a really important part, we're here on the ground doing the work, and who's advocating for us, like on the board, the folks who are guiding our organization. And, there wasn't really a good reason to deny that. So now we have a seat on the board of directors at the Economic Policy Institute. And we have other organizations who are now, seeing the accomplishments and wins that we're securing and are now emulating that. So there's a lot of copying and pasting of union contracts. And, in that way, we're raising the standards of our industry. So, I could go through all our contracts, but probably not a good use of our time. So,
yeah. Thank you, Daniel. That's a beautiful illustration of what the work actually looks like. Shevanthi?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I think I'll sort of go through some examples in the co-op sector. And even in the co-op sector, we see the need for unions. So some practical examples, I'll share first. A company out of Boston, Massachusetts. This is a mostly Latinx worker-owned landscaping cooperative of about 35 workers. When the workers began, there was no real sort of transparency around the financial statements. And since they became worker owners, they now review the company's financial statements on a monthly basis, first with the accountant, and then with the support and guidance of the management team. They each review the budgets in teams and analyze their own project estimates, how materials are costing or the cost of their labor, and they discuss when they're over or under budget for projects. So it's transparency, where they get to see what the company is making in terms of profit and what the expenses are, but they also get a even more fine-tuned look into how their productivity is impacting both the cost side as well as the profit side of the business, which really empowers them as workers to have more ownership over their own workplace and accountability to like good final products, but also to really understand like how are the profits and the proceeds from their labor coming back into the company. Another example is CHCA. This is Cooperative Home Care Association. It's the largest worker-owned cooperative, about 1,000 workers, worker owners. They're based in Brooklyn, New York, mostly BIPOC women. and they provide healthcare in the Bronx. This is also a unionized cooperative. So this one in particular, their union provides education and training, but the organization also has a budget line item specifically for coaching and training of all of its supervisors, so that there is a supervision structure that allows for workers to be in a healthy dialogue about changes to their workplace. So they get training on active listening, emotional intelligence, and how to give feedback, how to deal with conflict, how to bring up tough conversations, things like that. Now, if this was the sole training that these workers got, it may not be enough, but they get that, and they get an ownership stake in their organization, and they get union representation. So their voice and their power is really strong. Another example is on sharing power. This is Mandela Grocery down in Oakland, California. This is a smaller cooperative of about 10 workers, worker owners, and they all sit on the board. So they make decisions as board members on things to cut, whether to increase wages or decrease costs in some way. So they have to make conservative choices as board members. So they oftentimes have to wear different hats. And they designed what was called a decision board or decision zone that allowed for different levels of authority, a tool that helped them identify which types of decisions fit into which zones, which I thought was a really creative element and how it has been adopted by worker-owned cooperative sector in general. But it allows for organizations to decide what are the things that management should be responsible for, what are the things boards should be responsible for, or workers. Where do we have voice? Where do we have a vote? Where do we need to be consulted? And then who has the final say on something? That kind of decision board, collectively structured, allowed for this company to function as a shared governance body, while at the same time being worker owners of this grocery store. Lastly is this very large organization that many of you might recognize, Equal Exchange. It's a fair trade coffee, tea, and chocolate distributor. They're a worker-owned cooperative. They started out in Massachusetts back in '86. They have about 125 worker owners, and they've established ownership shares. They get dividends as workers, but the key thing that I think I want to point out here is the sharing of money. They have a differential of 4-to-1 wage differential between the highest paid and the lowest paid worker, and so gone to great lengths to be a competitive, market-driven business, while at the same time really putting a cap on the ceiling, and then ensuring that the floor of the pay differential isn't so far behind. So I'll stop there. I was going to go into our organization. If there's like 2 minutes, I could do that real briefly.
So I think I want to, why don't we wait? Because what I want to do is make sure we're creating space for Q&A.
Great.
So because there's so many questions I have, I can only imagine what the folks that are watching this pre-recorded panel are wondering. So there's going to be a quick break here, really quick, where we're going to transition into a live Q&A. But I won't be present for that, but both Daniel and Shevanthi will. Daniel, Shevanthi, thank you so much for sharing space with me for our pre-recorded panel. I've learned so much from you, and I'm grateful to know that I'm on this journey towards justice with each of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Sean.
Let's transition over now to questions.